The void between stars had never carried a fleet like this one. Grand Admiral Kaesyr stood on the command deck of the Ashbringer, her clawed hands resting on the obsidian railing. Below her, spread across the dark like a wound of light, hung 8,000 warships of the Threnn Ascendancy. Their hulls drank the starlight instead of reflecting it, a design choice meant to remind every lesser species exactly who they were dealing with. The Threnn had burned their way through 31 star systems in 4 centuries. No fleet had ever stood against them for longer than a single rotation. "Report, Commander Ilex," Kaesyr said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had never once tasted defeat. Ilex, her tactical officer, swept a clawed hand through the holographic display floating above the console. 3 amber eyes tracked the data streams without blinking. "All battle groups in formation, Admiral. Target system confirmed. Long-range scans show no orbital defense grid, no planetary shield network, nothing resembling a standing fleet." A pause, almost amused. "Their strongest weapons are still chemical fuel rockets." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the bridge crew. 50 rotations of surveillance," Kaesyr said, more to herself than anyone. 50 rotations, and this is what they call a civilization. She turned to the viewport, where a pale blue world was just becoming visible past the outer planets. "Begin the approach. Full formation. I want every population center mapped before we make contact." The Armada moved through the outer system with the same unhurried confidence it had carried into 31 conquests before this one. They passed the gas giant the humans called Jupiter, its storms swallowed by the fleet's shadow. They passed the rings of Saturn, glittering and useless, a jewelry box no one had bothered to lock. They passed frozen worlds with no strategic value, worlds Threnn cartography hadn't even bothered to rename. "Admiral," Ilex said, studying a secondary display, "long-range scans are returning something unusual. Their orbital installations, the structural tolerances don't match the materials we're reading. It's minor, possibly a sensor calibration error. Note it and move on," Kaesyr said. She had heard 100 minor anomalies in 100 conquered systems. None of them had ever mattered. Earth grew larger in the viewport, blue, white, achingly ordinary. Sensor sweeps returned exactly what Threnn intelligence had promised: primitive satellites, primitive radio chatter, primitive ambition dressed up as technology. Their moon hung nearby, scarred and silent, orbiting a planet that had no idea, or so the Threnn believed, what was coming for it. "Their satellite network runs on open radio bands," Ilex reported, something close to fondness in his voice, the way a predator might admire clumsy prey. "No encryption worth the name. Their largest orbital structure is barely the size of one of our shuttle bays. Admiral, by every measure we have, this is the softest target the Ascendancy has ever approached." Kaesyr allowed herself, for the first time in the campaign, something like ease. "Then let's not make it complicated. Fast, clean, thorough. I want this system pacified before the home fleet even hears we've engaged." "Admiral," the comms officer called out. "Multiple transmissions incoming from the surface. They're attempting contact." Kaesyr didn't turn around. "Ignore it. We sent our terms 9 rotations ago." They answered with nothing but questions. Her tail flicked once, the closest thing she had to irritation. That ends now. What she didn't say, what the official record would later omit, was that Earth's response hadn't been stalling at all. It had been a single, carefully worded message. "We would like to understand what it is you believe you're asking of us." The Threnn had read it as weakness. They were about to learn the difference between weakness and patience. "Sensors show launch activity," Ilex reported. "Aircraft rising from multiple locations. Atmospheric only, no orbital capability detected." Kaesyr almost smiled. "Metal birds, rising to meet a fleet that could crack a moon in half. Target their military installations first. Let's not waste the population centers on an opening move." Through the forward viewport, Kaesyr watched the human aircraft climb, small, slender shapes trailing thin lines of exhaust, nothing like the armored bulk of a Threnn interceptor. She almost pitied them. Whatever purpose those pilots believed they were serving, they were flying toward ships that could unmake a mountain range in a single volley. "Adorable," Ilex said, not quite masking his amusement. "They still believe altitude is a form of defense." "Let them believe it a little longer," Kaesyr said. "It won't matter in a moment." The order went out. Plasma batteries along the leading destroyers began to charge, humming with power that had ended entire civilizations. And then, 30 seconds before the first shot, everything went wrong. Admiral, Ilex's voice cracked. Targeting systems are failing across the fleet. Multiple ships reporting the same fault. Systems don't fail on my ships, Kaesyr snapped. Weapons are firing, someone called from tactical, but the beams aren't reaching their targets. It's like the space in front of them simply isn't cooperating. Kaesyr stared at the display. Plasma fire lanced out from a dozen destroyers, brilliant and lethal, and vanished 100 meters short of the human aircraft, as if it had struck an invisible wall that gave no readings at all. Impossible, she whispered. Every screen on the bridge went black at once. When they flickered back to life, a single face filled the main display. A human woman, dark-eyed, unhurried, speaking flawless Threnn. Grand Admiral Kaesyr. I'm Director Amara Solis, Terran Continuity Office. You have 30 seconds to power down your weapons and withdraw from this system. Silence swallowed the bridge. Who? Kaesyr began. For the record, Solis continued, as if she hadn't spoken. We did try asking nicely. 20 seconds. This is a trick, Kaesyr said, though her voice had lost its certainty. Continue the attack. Full spread, all batteries. More plasma fire lit up the dark and dissolved into nothing before it ever reached the human ships, which hadn't so much as changed course. 10 seconds, Solis said. I should mention, we've been aware of your empire for a long time. Your record is very thorough, very consistent, too, which is what made this easy. The countdown reached 0. What happened next had no name in the Threnn language. The human aircraft began to flicker, their outlines losing solidity for fractions of a second before snapping back, not damaged, not evading, simply unstable, as though reality itself were negotiating whether they were still there. Admiral, Ilex said, his voice barely a whisper, our ships are stopping. Not disabled. He looked up, 3 eyes wide with something the Threnn had no word for either. Just ceasing, as if someone reached into the equation and removed a variable. One by one, across the formation, warships that had survived 31 conquered systems simply were not there anymore. No wreckage, no explosion, no proof they had ever existed at all. All vessels, emergency withdrawal. Kaesyr shouted into the fleet channel. Full power to engines, now. It was already too late. The retreating ships found the space around them folding inward, an invisible wall closing where open void had been a heartbeat earlier. The Threnn Ascendancy's grandest fleet was caught inside a cage none of their instruments could even detect. Director Solis's face returned to the screen, her expression unreadable. Stopping, not destroyed. The Threnn Ascendancy has been classified as a stability risk, she said. Your combat assets are being neutralized. Your home territories are under quarantine, effective immediately. Any attempt to rebuild your weapons programs will be treated as an act of war. The deck shuddered. Kaesyr's vision blurred, and when it cleared, she was no longer on her bridge. She was standing in a small, quiet room with walls that seemed to shift between solid and glass. Her senior officers scattered around her, equally stunned. You are being relocated for debriefing, Solis's voice said, from everywhere and nowhere. The Terran Continuity Office apologizes for the deception. Our visible capabilities were somewhat understated. As the truth settled over her, Kaesyr understood, with a cold and total clarity, that the Threnn Ascendancy had just made the single greatest miscalculation in its 400-year history. They had assumed a quiet world was an undefended one. Part 2. The offer. The debriefing chamber didn't look like a prison. That was almost worse. Kaesyr sat across a table that seemed to bend light around its edges, her officers seated beside her in chairs that had adjusted themselves to Threnn anatomy without being asked. Director Solis sat opposite them, unarmed, unhurried, exactly as calm as she'd been on the bridge screen. You have questions, Solis said. It wasn't a guess. How? Kaesyr said. It came out flatter than she intended. Our surveillance was thorough. 50 rotations of data. Your species doesn't have the technology to do what you just watched us do. Solis finished. For the first time, something flickered behind her calm. Not cruelty, but the tiredness of someone who'd had this exact conversation before with someone else's empire. You saw our public face. What you were monitoring were the tools we chose to let you see. Commander Ilex leaned forward. For what purpose? Centuries of restraint. For this? Because the galaxy punishes visibility, Solis said. We learned that lesson early. Watching empires like yours rise, conquer, and eventually collide with something bigger than themselves. We decided we'd rather understand the danger before it understood us. A shimmer of light rose from the table, resolving into a map of the galaxy. Every system the Threnn had ever touched pulsed there in soft red, a chain of conquest laid out like a wound. We've watched your expansion for 3 centuries, Solis continued. Every system taken, every species subjugated, every choice your empire made when it thought no one capable of stopping it was looking. Then why not act sooner? Kaesyr's voice cracked, the first crack in 4 centuries of Threnn composure. Why let us continue? How many worlds paid for your patience? The question landed hard, and for a moment Solis didn't answer. Because we needed to know if you were capable of choosing differently, she said finally, quieter now. Every world you took away that possibility. We hoped we were wrong about what your empire would become. You kept proving us right. The map shifted, tracking the Threnn fleet's approach to Earth in perfect, damning detail. Every course correction, every targeting decision, logged and known before it had even happened. When your fleet crossed into our system, Solis said, diplomacy had already failed. Your answer to our first message told us everything we needed to know. Ilex shook his head slowly, still trying to reconcile centuries of intelligence doctrine with what he'd just lived through. 4 centuries of Threnn cryptographic analysis, and we never once flagged your communications as anything but civilian traffic. How does a species hide an entire second civilization behind weather reports and entertainment broadcasts? The same way you'd hide a blade behind an open hand, Solis said. We let you find exactly what you were looking for. Primitive weapons, primitive politics, fractured, quarrelsome, unthreatening. It's a very convincing picture, mostly because parts of it are even true. We are fractured. We do argue about nearly everything. We simply never let the argument extend to whether beings like you deserve to know what we could do. General Merrick, silent until now, finally spoke. What did you do to our ships? Our weapons? We didn't destroy them, Solis said. We revoked their permission to exist in that configuration, in that place. Call it quantum arbitration, if you want a word for it. Your engineers will spend decades trying to reverse engineer an explanation. They won't find one that satisfies them. The weight of it settled over the bridge crew like gravity doubling. An empire built on plasma cannons and conquest doctrine had been undone by beings who hadn't needed to fire a single shot back. What happens now? Kaesyr asked, and for the first time in the conversation, it wasn't a demand. Now you have a choice, Solis said. Your home systems are quarantined, not harmed. Your people are untouched. That can change in either direction, depending on what your empire decides to become. The map reformed, showing Threnn territory ringed by something that hadn't been there before, a boundary in space itself, patient and absolute. End the conquests, Solis said. No more subjugated species. No more weapons built to erase. In return, we'll help you undo what can still be undone. The worlds you've damaged, the species still living under your occupation. And if we refuse, then the quarantine holds until your empire either changes or collapses under its own weight. We've seen both outcomes before. Conquest-based systems rarely survive contact with a wall they can't push through. The silence that followed had no comfortable end. You're asking us to become something else entirely, Kaesyr said. We're asking you to grow, Solis replied, standing. Every species reaches this fork eventually. The galaxy is big, but not infinite, and it doesn't forgive empires that mistake size for right. She paused at the door, and Kaesyr found one last question waiting on her tongue. Why show yourselves at all? You could have stayed hidden, grown stronger, taken the galaxy for yourselves when you were ready. Solis considered that for a moment longer than Kaesyr expected. Because we learned something your empire never did, she said. Strength isn't measured by what you can conquer. It's measured by what you're willing to protect without being asked. The door slid open onto a corridor that seemed to stretch farther than the ship should have allowed. We don't want your galaxy, Admiral. We just weren't willing to let you have it either. As the transport carried them back toward Threnn space, Kaesyr looked back at the small blue world one last time. The world her empire had dismissed as primitive, undefended, beneath notice. Somewhere down there, Ordinary people were living ordinary days, entirely unaware that their world had just quietly ended a war before it started. The Threnn Ascendancy had spent 4 centuries believing that silence meant weakness. They had just learned, in the span of 30 seconds, exactly how wrong an empire could be. 200 meters below the surface of what maps still labeled a decommissioned research station in Nevada, Director Amara Solis sat in a briefing room far less theatrical than the one she'd used with the Threnn. No shifting walls here, no dimension folding table, just gray concrete, humming fluorescent lights, and a dozen tired analysts watching the same footage on repeat. "Fleet's fully contained," said Rios, the Continuity Office's operations chief, not looking up from her tablet. "Home systems quarantined, no casualties on their side, none on ours. Textbook, all things considered. Nothing about first contact with an interstellar empire is textbook," Solis said, rubbing her eyes. "We got lucky that they were exactly as predictable as 3 centuries of surveillance said they'd be." "Lucky," Rios repeated, with the flat tone of someone who'd run the simulations 400 times and watched them succeed 400 times. "Sure. Lucky." On the main screen, the Threnn fleet's approach played out again in miniature. Course corrections, targeting solutions, formation changes, every one of them anticipated weeks in advance by a modeling system that had, by now, learned to predict Conqueror-class civilizations with unsettling accuracy. "They'll tell their high command we're monsters," said Okafor, the youngest analyst in the room, still visibly shaken by what he'd watched happen to 8,000 ships. "Reality benders. Gods with a grudge. Let them," Solis said. "A story like that keeps them cautious longer than the truth would. The truth is a lot less dramatic. We've just had longer to prepare than anyone expected us to need." Outside, 6 kilometers above their heads, the evening commute rolled on exactly as it had the day before. Traffic lights changed. Coffee shops closed. A satellite passed overhead carrying nothing more dramatic than weather data and a few thousand phone calls. "No headlines. No footy. No parade." That was, Solis reflected, precisely the point. An empire had crossed half the galaxy, expecting to erase a civilization from a map, and the civilization in question would go to sleep tonight without ever knowing it had been at war. "Ma'am," Rios said, "Threnn High Command is already moving. Internal chatter suggests a faction is pushing to accept the terms. Another wants to deny the whole encounter happened and quietly rebuild. They always split," Solis said. "It's the ones who split toward denial that we watch." She stood, gathering the folder in front of her, thin, unremarkable, marked only with a designation number instead of name. "Log it. File it next to the others." Rios glanced at the shelf behind her, at rows of identical folders stretching back further than anyone in the room besides Solis had been alive. 31 conquests undone before this one, quietly, without a single press conference. 31 empires that had looked at a quiet blue planet and mistaken its silence for surrender. "How many more of these do you think there are out there?" Okafor asked. "Empires who haven't found us yet." Solis paused at the door, the same pause she'd given Kaesyr hours earlier. "More than I'd like," she said. "Fewer than there used to be." She allowed herself, for just a moment, something almost like a smile. That's the part that matters. Every one of them that chooses to change instead of collapsing is one less war the galaxy has to survive. The door closed behind her. Somewhere far above, Earth kept turning, unbothered, unaware, exactly as it was meant to be.